Immanuel Kant is arguably one of the most important philosophers of modernity and one of the most important philosophers in the history of philosophy. His name is familiar to anyone who studies philosophy, and his name is probably even familiar to those who haven't studied philosophy but have a general understanding of the importance of the history of ideas. To understand the philosophy of Kant, though, we have to take a step back to understand the world of philosophy that he is responding to, and that the world of German idealism is responding to. The world of philosophy that Kant and German idealism is responding and reacting against is the world of the so-called New Science, the philosophy of the Enlightenment, which can roughly be said to have begun with the publication of Sir Francis Bacon's Novum Organum, the New Science, in 1620. Tied to the New Science is also the great French philosopher René Descartes and his Meditations on First Philosophy. The two, together, brought the spirit of modernity and the modern project, the conquest of nature, begun by Bacon, and the attempt to understand the self, begun by Descartes, even though the quest for self-knowledge really has its antecedent roots, as almost everyone in philosophy knows, in the existential phenomenology and anthropology of St. Augustine. Modernity is therefore defined by Bacon and Descartes, the world of scientific conquest and the world of subjective understanding and the primacy of the self. In these two traditions of modern philosophy, we find the emergence of Immanuel Kant and the German idealist and romantic tradition. Bacon was an English philosopher, scientist, and statesman who helped establish the tradition of philosophy now known as empiricism. Bacon's philosophy was that of reductionist materialism, the notion and philosophy that reduced the world to an instrumented object, this including subjective beings, humans. Humans were nothing more than a material mass of atoms composed together in motion, as everything else in the world was. Anyone familiar with mid-17th century English philosophy, say especially of Thomas Hobbes, should see where they were actually drawing from. They were drawing from the philosophy of Bacon. However, man had the unique ability, according to Bacon, to dominate. And according to him, to advance our knowledge, man had to interrogate nature on the rack of investigation. Empirical science is the outcome of the instrumental exploitation of nature. This also brings about the end of the science of vitalism, the pre-modern scientific worldview begun by the Greeks and inherited by Christianity through Neoplatonism, which argued that the world and all life forms therein had distinct and particular life forces and intelligibility within them. Vitalism can be summed up as the outlook that living organisms are fundamentally different from non-living entities because they contain some non-physical element or are governed by different principles than are inanimate things. In essence, then, Baconian science, Enlightenment science, stripped man and the world of his vitalism, his life essence, and turned life, all life, into a material object of the world. Ultimately, man, though he has the power to dominate, is really no different from all the other objects in the world. We are familiar with this outlook today, reductionist materialism, and the notion that all life are objects. Popular scientific intellectuals and so-called philosophers like Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, and Daniel Dennett exhibit these contemporary views. Critics of this philosophy call reductionist materialism the nothing but outlook, which people might be familiar with. We're nothing but the movement of atoms. We are nothing but this. Love is nothing but the firing and the wiring of atoms and stimulation, etc. Humans are nothing but atoms, composed and hitting each other in a certain manner, which give the appearance of humans. Trees are nothing but atoms, composed and hitting each other in a certain manner, which give the appearance of a tree, a dog, and so on and so forth. Man, as we can see from this outlook, is ultimately reduced to an object in a world of objects, for all objects follow mechanical, mathematical, and material laws. Although Bacon was, properly speaking, a monistic materialist, all things have their origins in a single monistic material substance, his sidestepping and eradication of human consciousness and subjectivity produced a functional dualism, nevertheless. A dualism that pitted man against nature as the supreme object of force. Sort of like how Newton's laws of motion are in conflict and equal and opposite reaction. In the equal and opposite reaction of different material objects, it is the task of mankind and science, according to Bacon, to ultimately triumph and dominate. Man cannot dwell in nature. Man must overwhelm and destroy nature, to dominate nature. And this is what the forces of science, technology, and industry are all about. They unleash man's material movement and potential to become the most dominant object in the world. Again, our entire modern conceptualization of science and technology is ultimately rooted in the philosophy of Francis Bacon. On the opposite end of Bacon was the French rationalist philosopher René Descartes. Descartes is probably best remembered to posterity as the philosopher who proved human existence by saying, "I think, therefore I am," the infamous cogito ergo sum. The task of Descartes' philosophy, Cartesian philosophy, was to affirm the subject's own subjectivity, to affirm one's own subjective existence in a world of material objects. And so here you can see how Descartes' philosophy is also responding to Bacon's philosophy of materialistic and scientific conquest. The problem that arises from Descartes' philosophy is the classical mind-body problem. Are humans a mind inhabiting a body, or a body with the mind? What is the mind? Unwittingly, Descartes' dualism, so-called, ended up advancing the Baconian new scientific outlook. Man was a body, and his mind was nothing but matter. But this wasn't so much the problem with Descartes that the Germans' idealists took. Later generations of Cartesian rationalists ended up becoming subjective solipsists. That is, one could only affirm their own existence. From Cartesian rationalism and dualism, German idealism wasn't responding to the dualism of Descartes, but to the problem of solipsism. How can we affirm that we are subjects in a world of other subjects and other objects? It doesn't do us any good if we can only affirm our own existence. In a world where only the I think could prove its own existence, the pure self, I am forever cut off from others. I am isolated, alienated, and alone. The others that I perceive to be existing from a solipsistic perspective may not even exist. I can never know because I do not have access to their minds. and their subjectivity. I can never think as another beside myself. Therefore, I can never affirm and confirm anyone's own existence beside my own. You can start to see the problem with solipsism in its reductionist, subjectivist sense, which is where Cartesian dualism eventually led. It is this world of philosophy, the world of objective materialism and scientific conquest, in combination with the struggles of self-identity and subjectivism emerging from Cartesian philosophy, that German idealism springs from, coming into form in its grandest iteration with Immanuel Kant. And that is the world that Kant is also reacting against. German idealism and the philosophy of Kant is doing two things simultaneously. On the one hand, it is responding against the philosophies of the new science and subjectivism, but it also is inheriting the same tradition it is critiquing. This is what makes it modern rather than classical. Though the German idealists were schooled often in classical Greek philosophy as well as Christian theology, which has its intellectual basis more in the classical world than in the modern world, German idealism is taking the traditions of modern new science and Cartesian rationalism, dualism, and subjectivism, and trying to give them a greater, fuller foundation than the supposed weak foundations offered by Bacon, Descartes, and their followers. The task of Kantian idealism, or simply the task that Kant dwelled upon for nearly a decade before finally publishing the Critique of Pure Reason, is a response to how to achieve the so-called apperceptive unity of the I and the not I, the I think with other I thinks, and with the phenomenal world of space and time without allowing subjects to become purely objectified and materialized into conformity with deterministic mathematical laws. The goal of Kant is to defend the subject offered to us by Cartesian philosophy, as well as to affirm and prove how I can exist, how others can exist, and how we are different from all the other objects in the world without reducing ourselves to simply the isolated self of solipsism, or reducing humanity to a mass of matter similar and frankly the same as all other masses of matter in the world. Kant then revises the Cartesian and Baconian outlook by starting with the mind, like Descartes, but attaching the phenomenal world of objects and matter to the mind, something that Descartes and his followers did not do. Mind comes into existence with innate ideas. This is Kant's inheritance from the Platonic tradition of idealism. In this way, Kant is following Plato and can be said, somewhat rightly, to be a revisionist Platonist. The categories of the mind are also lifted from Aristotle, another philosopher whom Kant knew fairly well. While the mind comes into existence with innate ideas, thus denying the blank slate, the tabula rasa of John Locke, space and time, the phenomenal realm of experience and sensation, are forms of a priori intuitions that the mind projects rather than a posteriori experiences. It is the mind and not the body for Kant that is the seat of sensation and experience. And you can see how Kant, in asserting the primacy of the mind as the seat of sensation and experience, is trying to prevent humanity from being reduced to a pure body and a material object like all other objects. It is wrong to deduce, as the reductionists do, that our bodily experiences and sensations are only tied to the body. Kant argues that they are really tied back to the mind, as sensational experiences are ultimately rooted in consciousness, in thought, in the mind's innate ideas, and so on. If we do not have a mind, Kant argues, we will not actually experience sensational relationships, experiences, and rapture. If we were just pure bodies without a mind, we wouldn't have any sensational experiences whatsoever. What we experience comes through mental faculties, and mental faculties are not reducible to a bland hunk of meat and atoms, as the reductionist materialists claim. Plants, for instance, are material bodies with atoms, but plants, according to Kant, do not have sensory experiences because they do not have consciousness. Animals, which have material bodies and are also atoms, like humans, do feel because they have minds, but they are not self-conscious in the way humans are. Animals cannot know the transcendental ideals like humans can. That is, they are not rational in the classical conception of rationalism, in which rational means you are able to know the good, the true, and the beautiful, and live your life by choice of that knowledge in conformity with truth, goodness, and beauty. Only humans have that special reasoning ability. The mind, therefore, according to Kant, cannot exist without this ability to project the phenomenal realm of objects in which we are in, to understand the transcendental reality of the world, as well as our unity with the body. Again, this is that apperceptive unity that Kant speaks of. He doesn't see the mind separate from the body, as some people say. He doesn't see the body as separate from the mind. He sees the mind as primary, and out of the primacy of the mind flows the experiences of the body. And in this, there is unity of mind and body. And so, as you can see, Kant is also responding to the mind-body problem. This brings us to the synthetic a priori in Kantian philosophy. As the mind comes into being with innate ideas and consciousness, this means that our innate ideas, from Kant's perspective, can be confirmed in the world of phenomenal objects, the world of phenomenon. The a priori is that which is known without experience. The a priori is that which is true by definition, like all bachelors are unmarried. By definition, bachelors are unmarried, therefore to be a bachelor is to be unmarried. One does not need to meet a bachelor to confirm this reality. We know it by a priori definition. It is an a priori logical truth. A posteriori is that which is known or confirmed by experience. One needs to have a direct experience to validate an a posteriori or experiential claim to knowledge. For example, John was planting a flower in the afternoon. This can only be known from experience, that I saw or encountered John planting a flower in the afternoon. If I do not have this direct experience, I cannot make a valid epistemological claim. Kant's synthetic a priori bridges the a priori and the a posteriori together. Again, because the phenomenal realm, the world of experience, and the a posteriori, is a projection, ultimately, of the mind, the world of the a priori and idealism, which permits us to confirm our a priori ideas through our experiences in the phenomenal world. Therefore, I can also disprove an a priori statement if it doesn't conform to our lived experience. As you can see in Kant, the synthetic a priori unites the a priori with the a posteriori. A valid, true understanding of innate ideas will always be confirmed in this world of experiences. The synthetic a priori, then, is where the world of phenomenon is linked to the world of thought, or vice versa. The synthetic a priori is where thought and experience meet together as one in an apperceptive unity. That was the world lost by Bacon and Descartes, and that is the world that Kant and the entire German idealist and the Romantic tradition is trying to recover. Moreover, the synthetic and a priori coming together also enriches knowledge, because our experiences which confirm a priori knowledge confirms and ensures a priori knowledge isn't just dry intellectual thought. It has real-world reality and consequences. But Kant's philosophical project begins with the mind. It does not begin with the phenomenal world of objects or nature, like in Bacon. Instead, the phenomenal world is a projection of our mind, our thought, our consciousness. If I exist without thought, I am but an object. But I would have no knowledge of my existence. A rock, for instance, has no knowledge of its existence because it doesn't have a mind, it doesn't have consciousness. A rock exists because it exists as a projection of the human mind and its sensory experiences. We know that a rock exists, therefore we have an idea of what a rock is, and then in the world of nature and matter, we encounter a rock which confirms our a priori innate idea of a rock. Ergo, for Kant, existence and knowledge of existence is tied back to the mind, which is tied to the self. The mind and the self are one and the same. Besides being concerned with metaphysical, epistemological concerns, Kant was deeply interested in the question of identity and how identity was related to the larger metaphysical epistemic crisis wrought by modern philosophy. Looking upon the empiricists, man was an empty body, an empty man, as T.S. Eliot would later go on to explain, a hollow man in his poetry. Looking upon the rationalists, especially Descartes, the cogito ergo sum proved thinking, but not that I was actually the one doing the thinking. This is what led to the famous questions of whether or not we are living in a simulation. I may be able to prove from Descartes that thinking is going on, but I don't know if I'm the one actually doing thinking. For Kant, the question of identity was necessary for thinking. Thus, the understanding in German idealism of the conception of the human person and the subject as the I think. I have an identity because I have consciousness, because I have thought. The notion of the transcendental self, the I think, in Kant's ontological philosophy, is the grounding of the self with thought through the apperceptive unity of the synthetic a priori. Since my mind is the seat of sensation and I think and perceive, the self is behind perception and not an object of perception. Moreover, for Kant, the self is what we do. Selfhood is the activity of consciousness, action, and engagement with the phenomenal world of space and time. In this way, Kant bequeaths to German philosophy the notion of being as action, a being in the process of doing or becoming, and something that isn't fixed in the classical sense of being. The only thing fixed about the being of man is that he is rational, i.e., he is able to organize ideas. Yet man, being rational and organizing ideas and experiences, enhances his rationality through constant engagement with the world, activity, and organization of ideas and experiences. The more experiences we have, the more rational we become. Kant's understanding of the self is therefore twofold. There is the empirical ego and the transcendental ego. The transcendental ego is the true self, the self in itself, how we identify ourselves and understand ourselves. The empirical ego is how others identify us. In other words, the empirical ego is the self that others encounter and perceive from their minds, but they do not have access to our transcendental interior self. In this way, Kant believes he was able to solve the problem of solipsism. Although we cannot have access to the transcendental self of others, we can have access to the empirical self, the empirical ego of others. And insofar that we encounter the empirical ego and the empirical self of others, this confirms that other people, other subjects exist. If the phenomenal world is a projection of the mind, and there exists other persons, other selves who are not me, this is the origin of the I, not I distinction in Kantian philosophy that will be picked up upon principally by the philosophers Fichte and Hegel. The I is the total self, empirical and transcendental, through the true self, though the true self is always the, of course, by definition, transcendental self. Only I can be the total self because I control how I appear to others and I know myself. Sticking with how this relates to the synthetic a priori and the noumenon, the transcendental ego, projecting into the realm of space and time, therefore perceives others, the empirical ego. There is the unity. However, the noumenal, not I, is the transcendental ego, the true self, that I do not have access to with regards to others, and that only I have access to for myself. Therefore, I can only ever know another person in the empirical sense, in the world of phenomenology. Kant's philosophy of selfhood is intimately tied with, and the outgrowth of, his philosophy of the synthetic a priori and the noumenon. Thus, in Kant, as the famous saying goes, he had to limit knowledge in order to ensure knowledge. I can know about myself, and I can know that others exist in the empirical sense. I can know the empirical ego. I can know the empirical self of others. But yet that knowledge is still limited because the transcendental self of others is forever cut off to me. Only the transcendental self of myself can be known to me. Thus, we can avoid, according to Kant, the problem of solipsism through an encounter of the empirical ego and the empirical other in the world of phenomenology, the world of objects. We avoid the problem of solipsism, but by also affirming the reality that all experiences are ultimately rooted in the mind and consciousness, we also avoid the problem of reductionist materialism. And this is the heart of Kant's philosophy and the entire German idealist tradition. However, this was deeply unsatisfying to the post-Kantians, the first of whom was Johann Fichte, who built from the spirit of Kantian philosophy but wanted total knowledge, because the limited knowledge of Kant was insufficient in warding off the skeptics. Thus, from Kant's philosophy of the limited self and the limited other, we eventually arrive with the philosophy of Johann Fichte and the attempt to achieve total knowledge of the self and others united in the world. But in order to understand the basic philosophy of Kant, one must understand that world of the new science and Cartesian rationalism that Kant inherited and was responding to. The crisis of reductionist materialism and the crisis of solipsism moved and motivated Kant to present his philosophy of transcendental idealism, of the synthetic a priori, of the transcendental self and the empirical self, and how we can confirm the existence of others even if we will never fully know the other. Trying to understand the full knowledge of the other becomes the task of post-Kantian German philosophy.